Okay, I think we are good to go. You're all very welcome to our webinar, IVI webinar series for 2023. And today we are going to be talking about standards, navigating the current and future landscape. So I'm Joan Mulvihill. I am the Digitalization and Sustainability Lead at Siemens in Ireland, and I am the chair host for this afternoon's webinar. We are recording this for on-demand access, and it will be available on the IVI website afterwards. So I invite anyone who's tuned in today to do post your questions into the Q&A chat, which I will hopefully be able to access then and do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can during the session. And of course, you can also give glorious feedback and comments to our speakers also. It doesn't have to be an interrogation. Don't scare them. Just tell them they're marvelous. That also works. Because we do have a marvelous panel today. I'm not going to go through all of their bios because they're very extensive and very accomplished people, and they're going to do that all by themselves. But I can tell you, as you can see up here, that they are Barry Smiths, the ICT Standards Lead at the National Standards Authority of Ireland, and Professor Silvana McMahon, Assistant Professor at DCU. We have Marta Janczarski, Director of AI Standards and Strategy at Microsoft, and Brian McAuliffe, Head of Industry Standards at HP. So as you can see, we have a very good mix there of the infrastructural piece of the NSAI, the academic research side of things from DCU, and how that applies itself in the real world of industry with Microsoft and HP. And of course, that is a hallmark of all IVI and Empower research, is that it is a very, very strong link between industry collaboration with research and state bodies like the NSAI. So before we get into the whole topic, I should just tell you, if you're first time dialing in today, probably not, but just in case, the IVI is the Innovation Value Institute, of which Empower is part of it. It's a multidisciplinary research institute focusing on digital transformation and technology adoption, based out of Maynooth University. I always thought NUIG, or UCG as my college, was my favorite campus in the world, but I realized that Maynooth University is now my favorite campus in the world because it's like Galway back in the 90s. It is just so fabulous, beautiful place to visit. Strongly recommend anyone to visit. They're on site for any of the in-person events, but delighted we have a webinar today. It gives you all a chance to dial in. The IVI was founded in 2006. I think I've been involved since then. A collaboration with Intel, and the university has a strong track record of industry collaboration, both locally and internationally. And we run these IVI webinars monthly. This is not my first time in this rodeo chair as being the chair of a panel, but it's the first one I've done in a while because I seem to have been bad diary clashing on my part. So delighted to be back. Anyway, you can keep up to date with everything that's happening on IVI on their website and on their LinkedIn page. Specifically, this webinar series is brought to you by Empower, which is an almost €10 million collaborative research program focused on the area of data governance in the broadest possible sense. It's co-funded by the Science Foundation of Ireland and industry partners, and bringing together the SFI research centres of Lero, Adapt, Insight and Future Neuro. So it is coordinated most ably by my favourite professor, Marcus Helfert at IVI. There is a lot to read out here in terms of everything that it is doing, so bear with me before we get into the nitty gritty, but it is worth just telling you a little bit about how Empower works, because we are going to talk about standards in a minute and how you can get involved in standards. But a really good way of getting involved in anything is to get involved via Empower. And they have established a community of practice just over a year ago. And that community is very vibrant, real, participatory, and right across the cross-section of those interested in research. So industry, academia, public sector, and society. The quadruple helix of innovation, as it is called, where they're all working together to co-create data governance roadmap for Ireland, but also beyond. I think anything that we're doing here really does have global ramifications. Those recommendations and actions will directly contribute, as I say, to Ireland as a world-leading data economy. There are 3 specialist groups. I'm going to have to read these ones out so I don't miss any of them up. They are 3 specialist groups have been established as the community, as part of the community of practice in the area of today's topic specifically, which is standards, open data and data sharing, and data value about data governance. So co-led by researchers and practitioners. Really interesting there that it is co-led by researchers, but also by practitioners. And these working groups are focused on tangible outputs and deliverables based on stakeholder needs across the community. Looking at 6, 9, and 12 month timeframes. So no one should be afraid of getting involved in research thinking it's going to take them 3 years before they'll realize any value. These are looking at timeframes that are very realizable for stakeholders. And I think that's really important message. And it's always been a strong, I think, ethos of IVI, which is delivering practical implementable research for businesses. So anyway, if you want to find out more about that, please contact any member of the Empower team, and you'll again find all of the details up on the website. Today's topic, now let's get cracking on that. We are talking about standards and navigating the future, the current and the future landscape. So as I say, an absolutely brilliant panel that we have here today. Each one of them are going to give us a short presentation, 10 minutes each, more or less, and then we are going to break for Q&A from all of you guys, but also I have some questions for them too, I am sure. So we'll figure it out between us. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to our very first speaker, which is Barry Smith, ICT Standards Lead at NSAI. Barry.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Joan, and thank you to IVI and Empower for hosting this webinar. I think it's incredibly timely. And if you just bear with me while I get my presentation ready. I think it's a very, very, very timely. The time is now. I would hope that my presentation is informative. As Joan said, I have 5 slides and 10 minutes to give you a top-level view of standards, the role of NSAI in the development of national standards, European standards, international standards, and that intersection between standards, policy, and regulation. So there's a lot to unpack there. And of course, thank you to you for attending as well. Just a little bit about NSAI first. So National Standards Body of Ireland is a state agency operating under the auspices of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. There are 4 distinctly separate functions within NSAI, quite disparate in terms of their activities, but actually at the core of everything that's done by each of those functions is standards. We also have 2 NSAI entities operating outside the state, NSAI Inc. in the US, which has been in operation since the 90s to serve what was then primarily our US clients, but more increasingly our global clients and our clients for our designation as a notified body in certain areas. And most recently, we've established NSAI in the UK to ensure that our clients can continue to service the UK market. So the National Standards Authority of Ireland Act established us as a standalone agency back in 1996. NSAI, however, was around for a lot longer than that, and actually dates back to the 40s, to the Institute for Industrial Research and Standards. We would have been the standards function within that entity. The NSAI Act gives us the authority to, with the consent of the minister, develop national standards. It also gives us the authority to engage with European and international standards as we see fit and as we see necessary in supporting Irish-based experts and Irish-based stakeholders to get involved in standardization. So as a national standards body and in keeping with the membership model of CEN and CENELEC Europe, and ISO and IEC internationally, access to Irish-based experts and to Irish stakeholders' engagement in standardization here is through NSAI. We're also a member of ETSI, which is the European Telecommunication Standards Institute. They have a slightly different membership model. NSAI is a member, but individuals and experts can join that as they see fit. But in terms of, I'll call it the mainstream standardization.
Sorry, did you cut in? We can't see your slides.
Oh, really? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Excuse me, Brian. Maybe I didn't hit the share button. Just bear with me. Sorry, Brian. I don't know what's going on here. Just bear with me a moment.
We can see your screen, but it's not your presentation.
Okay, new share.
Thanks, Brian. I nothing because I thought for the background he did a slide for the intro to NSAI. So
Okay, sorry. Can you see that now?
yes, perfect.
Oh, excellent. I don't know what happened there. My apologies for that. So I'm not going to repeat it. I hope you got most of what I said to do with the first slide. And just to say, in terms of just my own background, I've been in standards almost 20 years, and before that I worked for a certification division where I was a quality and environmental management system assessor. And also with regard to standardization within the ICT area, the vast majority of standardization happens internationally through a collaboration between ISO and IEC through a committee called JTC1, Joint Technical Committee 1 on ICT Standardization. And how NSAI interacts with that committee is through a national committee, a national mirror committee, which is the term that's used globally for how engagement in standardization happens at national level. And that committee model is the mode that's used actually internationally. So we have a national mirror committee to JTC1, NSAI TC2, ICT Standards Consultative Committee, of which we have about 15 or so subcommittees covering a very diverse range of topics from, coding emojis to e-invoicing, data governance, blockchain, AI, MPEG, JPEG, IoT, digital twin, a huge range of subject matters are dealt with by our subcommittees. And I won't introduce Brian and steal his thunder, but Brian is the chair of that committee. There's one I also left out, a very, very, very important subcommittee we have on information security, cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection, of which Mark is the chair, and they'll talk more about that engagement later on. So in terms of my second slide, this may seem so obvious, talking about a definition of a standard, but there's a specific definition of a standard that I want to address a singular point on in terms of a lot of misconception about what a standard is and isn't. And I also want to introduce a particular type of standard which exists in Europe, and that's harmonized standard. Both of these definitions come from an EU regulation, 1025, in European standardization. And in terms of the definition of a standard there, I'm not going to read it out, but just that last part, with which compliance is not compulsory, really, really important. Standards are developed as voluntary documents. Any standard body that develops a standard, whether it's NSAI, CEN or CENELEC, or internationally ISO, IEC, JTC1, they develop those standards as voluntary documents. We do not have the authority to make these mandatory. That's for other bodies to do it. For example, regulatory authorities or in contractual arrangements between contracting parties. So standards in themselves are not mandatory. They can be made mandatory, but they're not mandatory. The other point I'll mention here as well, and I could get really sucked into a rabbit hole with this one, is that when an international standard is published, there is no onus on NSAI to adopt that standard as an Irish standard. We do adopt some international standards where there's an industry or a sector need to have it designated as such as an Irish standard, but we don't, as a rule, do it. However, and this is where Regulation 1025 comes in. When a European norm, an EN document, is produced, there is an obligation on all member states to implement a European norm as a national standard within usually 3 months. So the other part of that as well, obviously, you have to withdraw any conflicting national standards. So once the European standards it is out there, it's a standard for all the member countries. So that's one very, very specific requirement we have. And I'll just give you an example of that. And again, this is where I'm afraid of getting sucked into a rabbit hole on designations and acronyms. ISO 27001 for information management systems. That was adopted by Europe, so it becomes an EN ISO document. And it was adopted then nationally. So 27001 has a designation ISEN ISO 27001. So it's an Irish standard, it's European standard, it's an international standard. That standard and that designation IS is the exact same as BSEN 27001, which is the British standards adoption of it as a national standard in the UK. So moving on to a harmonized standard and the use of this standard within the European context. So a harmonized standard is a standard that's been mandated by the Commission to be developed to support the implementation of the essential requirements of a regulation. So it's a very specific type of standard. These standards requests then come from the Commission to the European standards bodies, and the European standards bodies then consider exactly what they need to do by way of developing a standard. In many, many cases, and particularly in the ICT domain, many of the standards that are considered for adoption and that are going to be developed to support European regulation probably would be international standards and start life as such, albeit they may need to be tailored to support specific aspects of European regulation that may not be addressed internationally. And then manufacturers and other parties within Europe would use the harmonized standard to determine conformity with the essential requirements of the regulation. And declarations of conformity to a harmonized standard provide a presumption of conformity with the regulation. Again, just save that and don't think too much about it. But it's a very unique European instrument, and I think it's just important to highlight there, and I'll circle back to it in a few moments. So in terms of the strategic importance of standards, the application of standards and the use of standards within trade is absolutely fundamental. There has been a whole plethora of documents, white papers, policies and strategies produced at national and European level and that underscore and highlight the role of standardization. At the World Trade Organization, of which ISO and IC are observer members, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement particularly states that the application of regulation standards and conformity assessment has to be fair and transparent, and it encourages members and those that adhere to that trade agreement to adopt international standards as well. Our own Department of Enterprise white paper on enterprise strongly acknowledges the role of international standards and certification supporting key government policies, enterprise policies. For example, in climate change and digital transformation, construction, medtech sector. So, and of course, a very recent one, the strategy for AI. Again, very, very strong links between that strategy and the standards that are currently being developed in that area. And as part of the development of that strategy, AI was tasked by our parent department to produce an AI standards and assurance roadmap, which you'll also see on that slide. At European level, the various strategies address the importance of standardization in supporting the single market. Very important. And I suppose very particular to what Empower is engaged in and what IVI is engaged in, the European policy on the 2030 digital decade references the importance of interoperability and how that applies to data and the establishment of data sharing, data intermediary services, and the movement of data across national boundaries. A couple of other documents that I want to reference here is the, sorry, I was just moving the slide a little bit there. The
I'm just going to
EU.
ask you to keep an eye on time, Barry.
Okay, yeah, the rolling plan on
Your
ICT.
10 minutes now.
Okay, the rolling plan on ICT standardization bridges the gap between European policy and standardization activities. The annual union work programme, again, clearly establishes a link between standardization activities and the objectives of the Commission in terms of supporting its regulatory framework. Another policy document there for those in the research community is the recently published Code of Practice for research for standardization in the European research area. Lest anybody is unconvinced how significant a programme this is at European level, this slide shows all of the regulation that's happened or happening in the digital sector. And particularly in terms of data and privacy, standards are being developed to support the implementation of those regulations. Two that I'm going to highlight: the Data Governance Act, published in 2022 and came into force in September this year, and the Data Act, which is at its final approval process and is expected to be published next year and coming into force in 2025. Key regulations that will be the implementation of which will be underpinned by standards. And last slide, John, you'll be delighted to hear, and thank you for pushing me along. This is an example of two action items that have been referenced in the annual union work programme from 2024 that I just referenced earlier on. There's over 70 actions that are included in this work programme, but two that have identified are standardization to support the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. And you'll see, they talk about trust and data sharing within the first request for European standardization. And in the second one, an interoperability for data processing services. This provision for within the Data Act, they specifically call up harmonized standards and standards to support the essential requirements of the regulation. And circles back to my earlier slide. Joan, I'll leave it at that. I could go on, but I think that's enough to give a high level view of standards and the interaction with policy, regulation, and actual standards development. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barry. I think that's been a really great scene setting to get us all started, because as I say, we want to talk about how people can get involved in standards, and through the NSAI is a really great route. And it was my first induction into standards. I did an NSAI Swift 10 many moons ago on cloud computing when I was in the IAA, and my joke at the time was doing an acronym word count at every meeting. And we thought, myself and Lavinia Morris, who's currently at Microsoft, sorry, Marta, she won't hang me out to dry for saying this. We had a joke one day that we maybe would make some up and say them in the meeting, see if anyone catches out, because we were so overwhelmed with the acronyms. But actually, it's really important to get in under the hood and understand how it all works. And I think that's been a really brilliant overview for us to get started. So thank you so much for that. Sorry for rushing you along, but I am very excited then to introduce my next speaker from not my old alma mater. I didn't study there, but I did work there. So when I was in IC4, so delighted to have Assistant Professor Silvana McMahon from DCU. Silvana, I know you have a particular interest in the health vertical, which I think is really great as an application from a research side, but also an application into real world. So delighted to hand over to you as our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joan. Thanks everyone for the opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen, but I think I'm going to have to ask Barry to stop sharing before I can do that.
Yes, Barry, if you could take down your slides.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank you. This is where we realized Barry had nipped off now to put on the kettle, having his bit done.
Absolutely. Are you seeing that okay, Joan? Perfect. Okay, great. So totally agree with Joan that Barry has done a really good job there of kind of setting the scene and giving us an overview of the standards landscape. So one of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the standards community of practice is looking at the kind of landscape that we have in terms of standards now and looking how we can bring that to the future. But one of the things that has been my experience while working in the standard community is basically that in order for any of these standards really to have teeth, we need to make sure that we're developing them in a way that they're easily implementable. So what I'd like to do in my presentation is just give my own experience over about 11 years at this stage of working with the standard community in the healthcare space in the development of risk management standards. So as Joan mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the School of Computing. I'm also a funded investigator with LERO. I'm an academic collaborator in the ADAPT Research Centre. I'm the current chair of NSAI's Health Informatics Standard Committee as well. So just kind of put that out there in terms of background. So as I say, this is going to be a case study of my experience of some of the barriers to implementation of standards that I personally have experienced in terms of development of standards. So as I mentioned, the standards that I'm going to be focusing on are actually focused on addressing risk associated with connected health networks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk management of health information technology systems and the standards in that space. Some of the evolution of those standards in terms of the technical reports that are associated with them and how the standards have actually evolved over basically a 15-year period, a little bit more than 15-year period, and some of the barriers to adoption of those standards that have been experienced and how we can actually take some of those lessons learned and apply them to future standard development activities. So as I mentioned, the main kind of focus of the standards that I've worked on is looking at how you can actually manage risk associated with connected health networks or health information technology systems. So the reason why this is becoming increasingly important is that we have seen over the last number of years that we have an increasingly aging population and we have increased incidences of chronic disease. So this is a major challenge for healthcare systems and how we can actually address those challenges going forward. And it has very much changed the way that healthcare is provided. So what we typically saw previously is that a patient would have an episode of need for acute care. So, you know, something would go wrong. They'd have to go to the hospital for a particular issue, and then, you know, they would basically revert to normal life. What we increasingly see is that, you know, increased incidence of chronic disease. So it means that the relationship that we have between patients and their caregivers is much more on an ongoing basis. So it means that we're continuously collecting data and we're having to integrate data from various services over a longer period of time. So it means that basically the type of relationships that patients and caregivers would have had for those kind of acute episodic periods of care are no longer the case. So rather than doing that on a kind of a manual basis, we obviously need to support that through health information technology systems and through connected health networks. And what we've seen and what I've personally experienced is that standards have to actually respond to the way that we now use technology in healthcare. So we have a lot of data that we need to manage. We have increasingly complex connected health networks. We're taking in information from regulated medical devices. We're looking at, you know, kind of general patient information. We're looking at information on well-being as well, and it's all coming together. So what we saw typically when I got involved in the standard space, which was back in kind of 2012 when I was doing my PhD in this area, what we saw is, you know, prior to that period, medical devices were pretty much standalone. They didn't really communicate with each other. But increasingly what we see is that medical devices are being designed now to exchange information and data with other devices and other medical devices. So traditionally at the time when this standard was being developed, it was pretty much the case that if a medical device was actually going to be designed to be incorporated into a network, what would happen is that the provider of the medical device would also provide the IT network. And it meant that they could exercise, you know, some amount of control over the way that the information was passed back and forth. And what actually happened is that hospitals ended up having basically, in some cases, thousands of these small kind of self-contained networks. So what we find now is obviously, because of the type of patient relationship that I mentioned that we have to manage, medical devices are increasingly being designed to be incorporated into healthcare providers' general IT network, which means that we can have full interoperability, but it also means that we're introducing additional risks. So we have risks to the safety, the effectiveness, and the data and system security of these particular types of networks. So in response to this, the IEC 80001 standard was developed in 2010, and it was looking at addressing the risks for IT networks that incorporate medical devices. So just to give you an overview of where this all kind of started, in 2003 and 2004, the FDA received a cluster of reports on cyber attacks in hospitals, and this led them to look at kind of development of cybersecurity guidance. So they were looking at specifically at that stage at the area of cybersecurity guidance for the use of off-the-shelf software. But when they started to look at it, it was realized that basically the network integration of medical devices needed to be addressed in a much more comprehensive and holistic way. So this led to the development of the IEC 80001 standard. The standard was addressed to responsible organizations. So that was healthcare delivery organizations who had these medical IT networks. Medical IT networks were defined at that stage as an IT network that incorporated at least one medical device. The standard also was addressed to medical device manufacturers, and it was also addressed to other IT providers. So you can see there that it's quite a diverse group of stakeholders that were actually being targeted by this particular standard. And even within responsible organizations, you would have stakeholders from clinical engineering departments and also IT departments. So again, even within responsible organizations, diverse stakeholder groups. As I mentioned, the focus of the standard was to look at the safety, effectiveness, and data and system security of medical IT networks. So the standard was published in 2010. Once the standard was published, adoption of the standard was considered quite low. So there was kind of feedback that the standard had some issues that were trying to be addressed in the publication of a technical report in 2015. I acted as international project leader and author and editor for this particular technical report. And what the technical report did was it tried to make the standard a little bit easier to understand. So it came up with 3 different items: a process reference model, which basically gave processes instead of the kind of bare bones requirements in the original standard. It also gave an assessment model, so it gave activities that needed to be implemented and a measurement framework that could be used. And it also provided an assessment method that provided healthcare delivery organizations with assessment questions that they could use in order to determine the capability of the risk management processes. So as happens with standards after a 5-year period, the IEC 80001 standard was scheduled for revision, and I was asked to propose an approach to the revision of the standard. So in order to do that, we needed to look at some of the issues that we had around implementation of the standard. And there were some surveys that were carried out that looked at the barriers to adoption. So the 3 barriers that were identified was that there was a lack of drivers to motivate top management. They didn't really understand the benefit of actually implementing the standard. There were some healthcare delivery organizational challenges. So again, the issue was that from an organizational point of view, IT departments and biomedical engineering or clinical engineering departments were not really aligned. They had different priorities, different understandings of terminology. So again, that was an issue. And just in general, the standard was considered to be too complicated and complex to implement. The technical report was developed to try and address some of that, but didn't fully address it. So in terms of actually addressing some of these standards, the steps that were taken in terms of actually producing the revision of the standard was, in order to address the lack of drivers to motivate top management, we kind of leveraged the understanding that managers have around the ISO 9001 standard. So again, that's quite a well-known standard. The return on investment associated with that standard is quite well understood. So there was a decision taken that we would align the revised version of IEC 80001 with existing management system standards. So standards like 9001, EN 15224, which is basically 9001 for healthcare, the risk management standard 31000 and ISO 13485, which is a quality management standard for medical devices. In terms of the organizational challenges, we had to address the issues that I mentioned. There wasn't really any kind of a common language around the multidisciplinary stakeholder groups. So again, we had to try and simplify some of that. And also in terms of the 80001 standard, in terms of trying to address some of the complexity, we put in a process to kind of define the context, understand organizational maturity a little bit better, and also simplify the structure.
And I'm going to do, oh, there you go, perfect timing.
I'm there.
I'll ask you to conclude shortly. I have a very high standard for timekeeping.
Perfect. So again, the kind of motivation around presenting that is just to give you an idea of, in order to actually make sure that our standards can actually be implemented well, we have to be conscious of the barriers that there are to adoption. So again, these were things that we were able to address in the revision of the standard. By doing that, we hope to have more implementation of the standard. So it means that we have a better chance of addressing the issues that we talked about. So safety, effectiveness, and system security. And again, this is something that we need involvement in standards development processes from our stakeholder groups so that these barriers can be addressed into the future. I think I could leave it there, Joan.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I wrote a great big note for myself here, which was, crikey, standards, the application of standards in healthcare, given the amount of change that the whole system has undergone in the last, I'm going to say, COVID years, but just when you said 2010 for medical devices, that seemed like another lifetime ago.
Absolutely.
And I just think of the amount of change that the health service has gone through in the last couple of years in an organization that's not used to that pace of change. And that's my segue into an organization that is accustomed to a pace of change, because, of course, technology companies are completely built on their agility and their ability to understand things like those differences between IT and OT, a huge issue I've encountered since I came to Siemens, which I was not really, having only done IT before, I wasn't as familiar with those huge differences in terms of perception and language. So yeah, to go from something like healthcare, which has been traditionally so stable in terms of how it operates, to the amount of disruption that technology is bringing, and how important standards are in that context, but also how difficult standards can be in that context when you're not used to it. So delighted to hand over to our third panelist, Marta Jęzarski from Microsoft. Delighted to have you on our panel today. And I know you're the Director of AI Standards and Strategy at Microsoft. So really, really interested in everything AI these days. So over to you.
Thank you. Bearing with me as I get the slides ready. But yes, as a short introduction, I am the National Standards Officer at Microsoft Ireland, and AI standards are predominantly the focus, but it is encompassing as well of cybersecurity and privacy. I've done standards for a number of years, and actually started my standards journey in medical devices. So it all leads to good things. So what I wanted to, and sorry if this is taking a minute, is that, sorry, can I just ask that? Perfect. Okay. So with that, what I wanted to actually talk about a little bit is the roles within standards development. And we sort of have usually a blanket statement of participating in standards and going through the development process. And usually that's very well articulated when it comes to something like ISO or CEN-CENLEC in the European space. But there's actually a variety of different roles for an expert in a specific area, and particularly when we're looking at data standards, where they come through in different committees, sometimes different subsets. It's really interesting to note where your voice can be heard and where your input is coming into. And so fortunately, we were able to start with Barry, and he gave a great overview of NSAI. And there's an opportunity for the Irish perspective, which means joining those committees under the auspices of NSAI, where you have the opportunity to engage with the Irish expertise, whether that's from academia, as we've heard, whether it's industry, and I'd say industry as a variety, particularly when we're looking at the space. There are smaller, larger companies. There are definitely some government representation and some consumer interest groups. So you have that diversity within Ireland, and you're able to bring that together within a committee. You're exchanging views, exchanging ideas, sometimes ideas for a new standard, for example, and you're able to reach a consensus through that discussion process. There are balloting processes, and that develops a national position. The next sort of step of participating as an expert is in the actual standard development organization through NSAI. So you have the opportunity to engage your Irish expertise, and then as an Irish expert, whether you're participating in ISO or ISO IEC, whether that's where all the IT committees are, or in Sensenlec, you're able to do that same type of discussion with hopefully the same type of diverse stakeholder group with the other country's respective experts. So this gets you an even wider discussion where you're bringing in your national position, but you're also being able to get into the writing. You're doing the contributions of the actual sentences. You're able to have back and forth with a wide diaspora of expertise to be able to land on what something would work. What I like to always say is like the common lowest denominator. Is sort of what you're looking to get through into that standard, into that text. And that way you kind of are able to, it really changes your ability to have that perspective. And especially if you're participating from an industry side, it gets a really great way to be able to take off some of the external hats and really focus on the technical content, and be able to engage with stakeholders that you don't really are able to pull such a diverse crowd around one table for this specific scoped topic. And that exchange of ideas, I think, is really critical. I would like to point out that there are other standards development organizations that are more industry specific or driven by sort of a consortium-based stakeholder group. So those are predominantly by industry sectors. So ETSI is as an organization that's quite common with its origins in telecommunications, though now they've sort of expanded further. You have another example such as SAE, which develops quite a number of standards, particularly that are pertinent for data as it pertains to the aerospace industry and that entire supply chain of manufacturing, and just the sheer large volume of data that gets accumulated and worked with to improve the quality of that production. And in that case, it's very diverse in terms of your participation. You might be participating as your company. You might be as an individual contributor. So IEEE has that model of participation. It really depends on the structure there, but it is definitely more individual. And you're able to, at least in that case, coalesce again with that industry that you might be part of, or sort of an opportunity to branch across the similarities or maybe differences across inter-industry. I will also quickly point out there are different roles. So I mentioned the technical expert role. There are, of course, other roles within these committees. You can take up the convenership of a working group, right? Where a working group oversees a certain number of standards that are being developed that are related to each other, usually in subject matter. You could be the chair of the committee, and Barry has mentioned internally in Ireland, myself and Brian have those roles for our respective committees. But you can also be liaison officers. And I wanted to mention that because I think it's quite important when we're talking about data, the relationship between subject matters and domains. So we've had the case study on health informatics, and just being able to pair committees that deal with what I would call more horizontal concepts, such as cybersecurity and privacy, and then the relationship in a specific vertical, whether that's health informatics, whether that's manufacturing or aerospace, as I've mentioned. I think those relationships, particularly when we're talking about data, really need to be highlighted, and the opportunities there to foster that dialogue. As I've mentioned and came through in the introduction, my focus definitely is these days AI standards. We've been working on AI standards since 2018. So for us, this is all old news. But of course, I think we're at a point where we can't go a day without an article in the media. And I think particularly the relationship with data is interesting to note. We've been developing standards on data quality actually pre having a committee on AI. It was identified as a standalone work that needed the attention. With the creation of the AI committee, these set of standards and further development of the series of standards as it became continues to develop to this day. it's a very common understanding of input. Your output is very much dependent on your input when we're talking with AI systems. And that set of governance around how you're looking at data quality, what is your validation, what are the concepts and that you need to be looking at when you're doing an analysis, I think are in a sense, they're the foundation of how you go about asserting quality of your AI system. And so those standards there is a collection of them that have already been published, and they're still continuing to develop subsequent parts of that series. So I think that's one to be looking out for. The other one that I'd mention is that in the AI standards that we have, particularly the developing management system standard, so that overarching big type of standard that looks at how an organization is managing its governance from a holistic perspective. There are controls around how you're assessing your data. How are you referencing the right level of protection when it comes to privacy, and the reference to those particular standards? And it folds those concepts and those standards cross linkages together. It's definitely, again, the ability to have that oversight from an organization, so you can say holistically as a company, as a not-for-profit, if you are in the process of developing or implementing an AI system, you have those check marks. There has been that thought process of how does this apply in our case scenario? Is this the right risk-based approach? And some implementation guidance on some questions, leading questions to answer as you're going through that exercise. This particular standard is of interest because it's our first AI standard coming out of ISO IEC that will be auditable. So there's that certification element to it that I think particularly in this environment is very highly sought after. And so this will be published in the coming months. I'd like to say probably around February of next year. So please do look out for it, and it will have an accompanying standards around the impact assessment. So how do you measure your impact assessment of the AI system you're deploying, as well as the auditable standard requirement for auditors. So we have that ability, of course, this is very new, of how do you even audit the implementation and the governance of AI system. So that sort of package of 3 standards will be published in sort of sequence over the coming year. And I think that will hopefully look at, when we're talking about the implementation, how do you actually implement a standard? Having that certification where you have a third-party audit come in, say, look, this is what we've done, this checks out, and you have some sort of agreed upon metric to go forward. This leads me into a very quick.
Sorry, this needs to be leading into a conclusion.
Just
in terms of time. Good.
Thank you.
If not fair.
So what I would leave this with is the fact that the way an industry looks at uptake of standards is very diverse. I know regulatory gets all the attention at the moment. We have the IVI Act. There's absolutely not to be minimized, but there's a lot of internal options. And for us, when you have a manufacturing and you have that ability to look at the supply chains and make sure that they're interoperable, when you're having many parts come together, that hopefully at the end, there's something systematic and consistent. Is a great opportunity for the adoption of these standards. And so sometimes, even though there may not be as flashy and front and center, it really, particularly when it comes to engineering teams, they're really widely adopted, particularly in the IT space, when you have so many different applications, such as in Microsoft. So I will leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have been, again, furiously scribbling notes here, and particularly at the very end there, when you put up about supply chain and manufacturing, and you talked about data quality, and I realized, I mean, the ramifications of having standards when we try and address things like sustainability is going to be huge. We're not going to get there unless we have that kind of consistency and standards. So I think really important commercially for that. And there's loads more I want to come back to on Q&A, but we have one final panelist left. And speaking of commerciality and making all this make sense, I am delighted that our final panelist is Brian McAuliffe, Head of Industry Standards at HP, with our with our final contribution to the panel. So you get kind of the last word in presenter mode.
Great, thanks, Joan, for the introduction. And I'm starting my 10-minute timer now. Okay, so you hopefully you'll hear the beep before your long finger goes up. So yeah, I'm currently the Director of Industry Standards at HP, leading their corporate standards function. And as Barry mentioned earlier, I'm also the chair of the NSAI Committee, National Committee on ICT Standards. So some of the stuff I wanted to talk about has been covered by Barry and Marta, so I'm going to skip over some of it. But essentially, here's the reasons why you should care, from our perspective at least, about standards if you're an industry player. Global trade, obviously, you know, the goal is one standard and one topic applied globally eases trade. Reputation, so if you can be seen to be taking part in an open consensus-based standard system, then it improves your reputation with other industry, obviously with government and with consumer organizations also. Public procurement, so you know, increasingly RFQs are being laden with requests for demonstration how you comply with standards. For example, the Information Security Management System standard increasingly. We've talked about conformance already. IP is another strategic sort of vector for standards engagement, and in fact, for some companies, it's a seriously big part of their model. In the tech space, companies like Qualcomm, Ericsson, and Nokia, huge businesses in IP related to standard essential patents. And of course, interoperability. So none of the systems we're all using today would be working without platform-based and device-based interoperability standards. So, I mean, given that we're talking about kind of data-related standards, Barry had a big long list of items in Europe, and I've just picked out 5 or 6 of them on the left here. So these are what I'm calling the policy or legislative drivers that are GDPR, I guess, has been around for a bit, but some of the other ones are much newer, and they're going to be hitting our screens very, very shortly. And the AI Act being, you know, early next year is going to hit us. So that's driving the need for standards to help us demonstrate conformance, etc., with the requirements. But also you have technology developments, so things like smart cities and the metaverse and actually the brain-computer interface. There is a committee set up already writing standards for that topic. So you can imagine the data governance type of implications for those areas. And I should mention also, it's not just Europe that is driving this. The US is hot on our heels in some areas around cyber and AI, and this risk management framework, the NIST, developed by the National Standards Institute under the US government. They've published recently a risk management framework for AI. And I know that Australia and other countries are bringing out requirements in this area too. So global standards, if we could have one standard on each topic, that could be a reference by all of these emerging legislations, and of course that's the goal. So in Europe at the moment, just this week or last week actually, the European standards bodies CEN and CENELEC established what they call a focus group. And that is essentially going to look at the whole data economy. In particular for this discussion, standards around data governance and interoperability and data quality, which Marta rightly referenced there. So what a focus group does is it looks on the one hand at the needs from a policy regulatory perspective, and it then does a bit of a landscaping and a gap analysis. So, you know, given what's developed and under development out there in standards, where are the gaps that are going to help us with these emerging requirements? And then at the end of it's probably like usually they're a 2 to 3 year effort. But you know, within a year you'll start seeing meaningful output. The goal is to come up with a set of recommendations for the CEN and CENELEC boards to the directors, their technical committees, to develop standards on certain topics. So that's really recent, and through NSAI. NSAI have a role, and Barry has a role in the one of the board committees that's active in that area. And internationally, where the data governance standards work is happening, is I've just highlighted a few of important parts here, but the URL in the middle of the page is where you get loads of information on this committee. It's started in 2013, and its main focus initially was IT governance. It's in the last couple of years that data governance has been sort of added to the scope of its work. And you can see there's one of the working groups, governance of IT, also is the one that publishes the standards on governance of data. You can see its scope up here on the right. The governance of data bit has been added, and Marta also referenced and one of the standards on the governance implications of AI that was developed by this committee working collaboratively with the AI committee, which obviously makes sense. So I mean, it's a pretty active committee. There's something like 36 countries taking part. And there's 13 standards under development at the moment. You can actually, this slide here, I've plucked out of those 28 standards, and the ones under development, here are the ones I think you might be interested in. Again, starting with the governance side of IT, you've got the 38500 series, and then piggyback on that, you've got the governance of data set of standards at the bottom. The third or the second bullet from the end there, 38505-3, that was actually the lead editor, and that was Marta's predecessor at Microsoft, Terry Landers. So Ireland has been engaged in this topic and continues to be. One of the key ones under development that I've highlighted on the right is, I think, should be of interest to anybody who's involved in the development of products, services, applications in the platform space. So it's going to be, and I think the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act in the Commission are going to be, this standard is going to be very relevant for those areas. One more slide. So I also was kind of asked to talk about, okay, well, you know, how do companies, how does industry approach this whole thing? And so on the bottom left here, I mean, I like to look at it this way with the 4 quadrants. So externally on the bottom left, you've got all these standards bodies, writing standards. So, okay, you know, which ones should you engage with? And of course, they're all competing for your eyes as well, and your money, of course, some of them. But many of these are working on data-related standards. So that has to be considered. When you're moving clockwise, you know, particularly post-COVID, there's a huge emphasis on technology sovereignty and supply chain resiliency. And that is driving a deglobalization trend, of course, generally, and that also applies to standards. And the fear is that you have countries or regions developing specific versions or flavors of standards, which is anti the, you know, one standard across the world, which we want. And layered on top of that, of course, each of the regions, China, Europe, and US in particular, have in the last couple of years published standardization strategies, and they're all aimed at trying to strengthen each of the regions, you know, a role in driving the standards that it feels are important, you know, for its strategic reasons. So they're all, you know, areas that are competing. And then, of course, the bottom right, you've got what we call tech or regulatory proliferation. So in many of these areas, these technology areas, they were not regulated up to recently, you know, let's say. So like GDPR probably was, you know, one of the first areas that has driven that. So now you've got mandatory requirements coming in that companies just have to be aware of. So putting all that together, you know, internally in a company, these all have to be considered, and you know, it's very hard to convince. Sorry, you have to have a really strong business case to convince executives to fund people like Marta and me, right, to travel around the world doing this stuff. So you have to be able to connect these external trends with your business priorities. So, you know, so what markets are your companies trying to sell into? Where are your supply chains? Where are you going to store all your data, etc. And you know, it's a very good idea to pull together what we do in HP is called a steering committee, where you've representation from the global functions and the business units, a centralized budget, make decisions, and off you go. So I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I realize I have 28 seconds left, Joan, and that has brought me kind of pretty much to the end of my slides. So I'm going to give you back 20 seconds.
Thank you so much. That was super and super fast and so timely. Thank you, all of you, all four. I have written down so many questions that I have. I'm going to have a little look at the chat, but I want to get our own. I want to get our own Q&A going. Let me just see what's in here from the very quiet participants. Okay, they're all shy for now, so we're leaving it to me. Now, I knew I should have let you run over, because if you'd run over, I wouldn't have to work so hard now and come up with all my questions, but I have loads. Who will I start with? Well, we start at the top of the page, and we'll start with Barry, seeing as he kicked this all off. Now, Barry, I had a marvelously positive experience working with the NSAI. And Terry Landers Martha was actually involved at the time. It was the cloud computing Swift 10. And it struck me, Martha, one of the things that you said was you can get working on something before a committee even exists. So we, as a membership body in the Irish Internet Association, we were working away on this cloud adoption kind of decision support document that we felt businesses need to help them work out what their cloud adoption strategy was. So, but we went and approached the NSAI, or they approached us. It was lovely. It was really, really accessible and easy. But that was a long time ago, and that was my personal experience. Barry, how do people get involved? Do you go running into your office going, hi, can I help? Can I be on a committee, please? Do you have to go in with a particular standard in mind? How does someone listening in this call get involved?
Well, I have my own perspective on this, which is favorably disposed to NSAI, but there's a couple of things about NSAI above the vast majority of other national standards bodies out there, is that we don't charge fees. Brian and Martha will attest to the fees that their colleagues have to pay in other countries to participate in the standardization. So as a state agency, we don't charge fees. We see that as our subsidy to industry, to experts and stakeholders to get involved in standardization. And we traditionally are very accessible and amenable to anybody that has a particular interest to get involved. Your interest can be across a really broad spectrum, as broad as the side of a bus, if you want. If you want to just have an understanding of standardization, and let's say, want to have visibility into what's happening for your own research or that of your organization, you can be an observer. Very, very passive engagement. We tend to facilitate people at that lowest level of engagement, but we also facilitate people, the sort of hyper users, the people like Martha and like Brian and like David Philippe and a few others, and they would be the exceptional ones who have the resources and the commitment from their employers to take significant leadership roles at European and international level. So
you don't have to be a hyper user, though, like Brian or Martha, to get involved.
No, you don't.
I certainly wasn't. I'm going.
And the thing about it is that you may not have the resources to engage sort of at European international level in terms of traveling or whatever, but you can engage nationally. You can review documents. You can provide comments. You can help build national positions and support consensus at a national level, so you can be part of that conversation without being the hyper expert. So we're generally quite amenable to people getting involved. However, if people don't turn up, we tend to let them go from our committees, but the door is always open for people to engage and come back and engage in other committees. We're quite open.
That's a really lovely positive message, and certainly my experience. And I have to say, when I was in my old days in the IAA, we wouldn't have had any money. We were a non-profit. We hadn't been. If that had been a barrier, we wouldn't have been able to participate. Certainly not at an organizational level. Our individual members of the working groups, people from Microsoft or wherever, would have, but we as a representative body wouldn't have been able to participate. So that was really important, and the fact that we didn't necessarily have that background. Brian has his hand up, which is good, because my next question was to go back to Brian. And actually, one of the things that you said that stuck in my mind was, because they're always chasing your money. So good to know the NSAI don't. But that's the question that I think people might be interested in knowing is it expensive? How expensive is it?
Of course, like every good answer, it depends. But before I answer it, the reason I stuck my hand up was because I wanted to mention the Stand ICT, which is a European Commission funded program that can provide funding, particularly for SMEs and individual contributors, to give them up to 10,000 for joining and traveling. So that's a good sort of vehicle that's out there, and I'm sure Barry and us can provide more info on that later.
That's really good. And I'm gonna interrupt again because I'm conscious of my battery might die and I need to plug into the other wall. But that was another thing that crossed my mind too, in relation to people getting involved. We keep talking about a skills shortage. We talk about Ireland being a leading data economy, and that's very much what Empower are at the forefront of. And we want to attract people into careers in these areas as well. So actually making it accessible like that, being able to access funding. So maybe an organization that cannot afford to have a dedicated standards person like Microsoft would have or HP would have, you could be working away in your career, maybe in IT or some other area of the business, but standards are particularly interesting to you. You can get involved. There is funding there to help if you want. You can go to your company and kind of get support to get involved. So
yeah, and so just to put some detail in that, Joan, you've absolutely, your last comment there is very relevant. So even though Martha and I, or Barry, kind of inverted commas, refer to us as hyper users, yes, we are.
But hyper users works as well.
Yeah. But like in HP, I can speak my own example. We're a small team of 4. It's the technical experts around the company that go and do the actual proper legwork and writing the standards. In HP's case. So once you can convince a VP or a director that this standard can really either hurt or leverage your business plans, then he or she will find the 10, 20, 50,000 needed over a 3 to 4 year period to let that person participate.
Brian, you mentioned something there, and I want to put it to Silvana, because one of the things that you put up on your slide was, why should organizations do it? And sometimes, and Barry referenced this as well, it's like sometimes you can't even tender to participate in a market unless you're have the standards, you're ISO compliant with whatever vertical you're in, maybe, or whatever. One of the biggest barriers to innovation I've heard in health sector, particularly in Ireland, for innovators, for startups, is being able to engage with the health service in Ireland as a startup. To what extent does having the appropriate standard, help? And where do you think the greatest opportunities exist or gaps are there in healthcare in Ireland in relation to standards that you think as a group people should be interested in focusing on?
Yeah, so I suppose just there's a lot in that question. So I suppose just
I'm plug in my laptop just in case we die. I'm trying not to give anyone vertigo while I'm doing it. Seamless moving. I'm on a wheelie chair. I did not think this through. Now we've got a full view of my garden. Okay, fire on.
Yeah, so I suppose, one of the kind of, I suppose, again, my kind of presentation was focused on my kind of experience within the standard development organization that I had. And I suppose, again, just to point out that when I got involved in that, it was as a PhD student. And I suppose one of the opportunities that, kind of Barry has spoken to and Brian has spoken to, that if you're talking about barriers to kind of innovation, is the kind of understanding of standards and understanding what's relevant. A really easy route to kind of getting your arms around that sort of stuff is through that involvement in the kind of standard committees. So again, like as I mentioned, I'm the chair of NSAI Health Informatics Standard Committee. So engagement with those kind of committees means that you get a really, really comprehensive overview of what's happening in the standardization space. And you do have the opportunity, when there is a standard in development, you'd have the opportunity to make your opinions and your experience heard. So for me, as a student in those spaces, my voice was as relevant as any other person who was on any of those committees. And I had access to, the greatest experts globally, because it was ISO and IEC that I was working with. So there's a huge amount of benefit to getting involved. And for, obviously since COVID, there's a lot of kind of standards discussion that are now online that previously would have been in person. So, those are easy routes as far as I can see. And as Barry kind of mentioned, obviously there is increasing focus on regulation and that interface with standards. That's only going to grow over the next period of time. So again, those are where the opportunities are.
Yeah, from a startup point of view as well, just even building that network and building those relationships with people through committees, through involvement, and I'm going to say involvement in standards, but I'm also going to say involvement in organizations like Empower and the IVI. And I'm not plugging them here. I'm here as an independent person, but I do think that building out that network, I mean, that's what Empower is all about. It's looking at data governance, and that's to come back to, and I want to talk to Marta about this. When we're talking about standards and how IT standards now also include data. I mean, when we look at AI, the fact that you guys have been working on it since 2018, and I don't mean you as in Microsoft, but in general, the big tech community has been looking at standards in this area for quite some time. Data is really the stable part in the AI bit. So if the process is I'm going to reframe this. I did an event last week. We were talking about AI in the context of manufacturing, because I work for Siemens, and particularly in life sciences and pharma. And one of the things where AI is really problematic there is FDA approval. So let's take that as a standard and say, right, okay, you can get FDA approval for for this end product based on this process. But if any dynamic in that process is so dynamic that it is generative and constantly learning, then how does the standard fit with that? So then you have to go back a step and say, well, we can use AI offline effectively, and then but put it in almost at a static point later. So the only thing that you can actually have that is constant in all of that is if the data is treated in the same way as a raw material, then the data purity is as important there as any of the chemicals or biologics that you're using. You're nodding. Am I right? I don't know. So
yeah, I mean, I think I really like I mean, having worked at GlaxoSmithKline previously, you're speaking my language. Looking at your starting ingredients in a chemistry reaction. So I do think you're right, and it is a good way, particularly when you're having the conversation. And I've had the privilege of being some of those discussions with different regulators of industries, of how do you find sort of the constants, where do you find the best sort of assurance when you're looking for that safety and efficacy criteria. And I think it is a bit of a dance, because we have regulators that are coming out with guidance documents, particularly when you look at the FDA. They've been crafting and versioning a guideline for AI uses in medical devices now for a few years, but we've also seen that differentiation where you have a very high act, such as the EU AI Act, but then you have a smaller sort of regulatory vehicles, such as you have in NIST and the executive order that just came out a few weeks ago in the US, and how that will sort of look at maybe some of the more tangible ways of addressing some of the challenges. But I think, to your point, data is definitely a constant. The other thing that I would say is being risk-based, right? A lot of what we've looked at when we went through this exercise around privacy a number of years ago was getting your risk assessment right, getting your impact assessment right, identifying where are the possible vulnerabilities. Is it the type of data you're using? Is it the type of where is the output being used in that context? Making sure you have the right evaluation, I think, goes a long way in ensuring that you then have the right guardrails, because it has to be well suited. I think, just as are you applying the right AI system for what you're looking to get out of it? And having those types of questions as your safety checks, I think, and as we start maturing that conversation and making it more around that risk-based approach, the variability will become a little bit easier to manage, because you can adapt your impact assessment, change the guardrails, and be able to demonstrate the thought process that you've gone through that.
I think that's a really important point, that bit about a risk assessment. And it speaks to some of the points that Brian was making. Brian, I'm going to come to you. I'm conscious of time as well, even for myself. But Brian, I do want to ask you that question about getting leadership on board. So you're in your organization, you're hitting roadblocks, you really are passionate. I actually, I was going to say this, you're either really passionate about standards or not. You're the kind of person who went to university and did business, and you decided you were going to do tax and accounting. You either get standards or you don't. Do you know? So there's some person listening in on this, or going to listen back to it, and they're going, I really, really am so passionate about standards. This totally floats my boat, this kind of rigor, and I just cannot get this, creative entrepreneur, founder of my organization to take this stuff standards. I don't know how to build that relationship with them so they can really support me on my journey. Brian, what do they do?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say none of us leave school saying we want to be professional standardizers, right? It's a pure fluke. And by the time I realized I was, mid-career standardization person, it was too late to do anything else. All right. And now I've been able to bluff everybody in the last 10 years. So, okay, it's working so far. But it's a good point, because one of the 3 pillars of the European standardization strategy is standards education. And we're trying to work to build into, even as far as down as low as second level school, some of the notions and concepts around, standards, etc. So that might yield fruits in the future. But your general question about, how do you convince somebody internally, is very difficult, because particularly you might have convinced somebody, and then there's the company figures are struggling, and the first thing that's hit is travel, for example, all right? And you can't do this stuff unless you travel. That's what we thought, and then COVID happened, and now we're doing a lot on Zoom, so you can do a bit of it. But the key point is trying to make the connection between. So you have to get very familiar with the company's 3 to 5 year plans, which of course change every 6 months. But and then you got to hook into some key aspects of product, solutions, services that your company is willing to, because that's when you get to support. But also an executive sponsor. So you have to find at least one VP / senior VP who at least can talk about what standards are, and will open the door for you to talk to budget owners. Is my key lesson from me.
And that's really important. And I think Marta mentioned something. Well, I know she mentioned it because I wrote it down. But it kind of gave me hope for even myself. There's a fear around standards, because we think of a standard and our hand automatically goes up, like it's this really high barrier. Like it's so I get in trading blocks like Europe, US, China, they're almost considered like barriers to entry. It actually keeps competitors out, and to a certain extent, or protects indigenous. It can do if you have a different standard towards another one. But in terms of a business being able to achieve the standard, you did mention something there, and I know you're not saying the standards are low, but you did mention about the common lowest denominator. It is about, we tend to have to standardize to encapsulate as much as possible rather than to exclude as much as possible. So people shouldn't be afraid of trying to go for the standard, thinking that the standard will be too high and they'll never be able to achieve it. The standards are set to be achievable. And what you're really trying to do is have standardization rather than reaching a very, very high standard. Is that a correct interpretation, or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly the common denominator is absolutely something that we can do as a baseline, something that I always said that it was building the foundation blocks so that you can innovate in a certain direction with having a certain level, not only assurance of what you're doing, but just assurance that this is actually the direction that we're doing for this technology, so that you have the common language, even terminology standards, as much as maybe they aren't used very often once you've read it through for the first time, but those are very critical, because you want to be able to speak the language if you're innovating in a space, to make sure that you're moving forward with it. When I meant about the common denominator as well, is when you're looking at AI standards or privacy standards, you need to have something that works in a variety of spaces.
Yes.
We've talked about medical devices, we've talked about manufacturing, the autonomous vehicle space. They're vast implementation areas. And you want something that can bring those together to make sure that we're not then innovating in silos where, in fact, there's something about the manufacturing space in pharmaceuticals, which is actually might be very useful in a different industry. We don't want that limitation because we've set up the terminology and the processes so different from each other. So this is where I feel, you know, it is hopefully really welcoming in that way of saying, okay, well, maybe it's not written specifically for me, but in fact, there might actually be a lot of versatility to it. And it gives you a certain level of assurance on where is the sort of the ground level.
And agility as well, I'm guessing,
Absolutely,
to
yeah.
pivot. You know, when we're innovating, we often have to pivot. I'm sure Silvana confronts this a lot in a research perspective. And it's like, well, we started off here and we ended up over there, but actually having those standards underpinning it. I did notice you were nodding there, Silvana, when I was saying some of this stuff, and certainly more to Marta's response, I'm sure. Because I'm going to go back to Silvana now, because again, I'm conscious of time, and we have 8 minutes left, and that gives you all a minute and a bit each to have your final say before I put up one last slide, which I know the IVI are going to throw up in a minute on the screen after you've all had your last word, just to give you anyone listening in, just an update on what's coming next. But Silvana, I'm going to start with you. What are your final parting comments for listeners?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the kind of things that I would suggest is, again, involvement in the community of practice. We have an opportunity where we have a pretty active group of people who obviously, hopefully we've demonstrated today, are pretty passionate about this, and there is a really good opportunity to get involved in that. I suppose just kind of follow up on Marta's point as well. The reason I was kind of nodding along is, as I mentioned in the technical report that I developed, it looked at kind of capability around, you know, assessing your capability in terms of risk management processes. So there is absolutely a view within standards to kind of get that baseline and then focus on improvement from that point as well. So again, I think that is a really good motivator for implementation of standards as well, is that you can actually demonstrate improvement and you can baseline yourself against others. So yeah, I suppose call to action is to get involved with our community of practice.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Barry, I'm going to come to you next.
Well, yeah, it's just with regard to, you know, the point you made about standards and the high bar. I mean, standards really represent an agreed solution. And there are lots of checks and balances within the process to ensure that you have an agreed solution and that you have a solution that the vast majority can move on with. Again, it might seem cliche, it's a journey, not a destination. But with regard to stakeholders, and I'm just going to circle back to one of my slides, the European Code of Practice for Standardization Code of Practice for Standardization European Research Area. The Commission are really trying to advocate many different stakeholders, and in that case, researchers get involved in standardization. They see standardization as an opportunity to promulgate research and to drive innovation. And there are lots of programs in place to support the research community. I know Dave Lewis is looking at the code of practice. He sees a lot of benefit in it for ADAPT, and I'm talking to him about that. But just with regard to, you know, stakeholders and experts getting involved, you know, Marta and Brian represent, you know, large multinational companies. I think there was never been a time where there's a need for a more diverse group of people to be involved in standardization, particularly when you see this technology and its application. And that's a big challenge for the standardization community to bring in other stakeholders and hear their voices and get them involved.
That's right. I mean, that was the point, and I think I may have hinted my bias there too. And I work for a large multinational, but when I was asking some of the questions, it was about startups and innovators and how they can get involved and not feeling like that this does not apply to them. So yeah, I'm really glad you made that point. We do need the innovators, the startups to get involved. So who will I go to next? We'll let the ladies have the last word. We'll let Brian, because he had the last presentation. So Brian, you can go next. Your wrapping up comment.
Thanks, Joan. Yeah, I just made a note there, just one point before I kind of did a wrap up point. But yeah, you know, I agree that standardization and the lowest common denominator, etc., and you know, it's all good, but also differentiation can be a part of the strategy. In other words, particularly if you have a technology you want to get proliferated, then a strategy that does work is having the standards essential patent related to that technology incorporated in the standard. Okay.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
I'm not saying that this is a model that HP particularly follow, but it works for some companies. So the point there is, your strategy has to be multi-pronged. Okay, depending on your technology and your aims. But I would sum it up as saying to try and build the argument internally, you should really stress to the decision makers how standardization gives you huge opportunities for developing your leadership skills, your communication skills, your consensus building, dealing with multi-cultures. All that stuff is very relevant skills to bring back inside your company, so it benefits them long term. And then finally, and I think Barry just mentioned it there, I mean, you get a sense of you're contributing to the greater good as well. And as an example, and Barry mentioned diversity and succession planning, Ireland, as of last week, has been approved to lead now an international effort on how to develop succession planning guidelines for the standardization body, ISO/IEC JDC1. And, so that is an opportunity for Ireland to, well, we are taking a leading role to bring in some really good practices and principles around inclusion and diversity. So
Right.
with that.
I feel like I'm going to end up volunteering myself now, but in a former life, before I worked in tech, back in pre-2008, I actually was the head of family business services succession planning at BDO. So I have quite some experience in the area of succession planning, mostly in family businesses, but the core principles are transversal skills. I'm not volunteering. I'm very, very busy, but you never know. Marta, the final word, please don't reverse me out of what I've just said. Marta, you say something else.
Oh, no, absolutely. Just in words of encouragement. It's something that, we're happy to say Brian is leading on internationally and has been approved as the chair for having that position and for leading that conversation on succession planning. Ireland differentiates itself right now with the ability of having that diversity and looking at that outreach. Our committees are really welcoming. It is maybe a steep learning curve, and knowing the acronyms, as you mentioned, the processes, the voting, the amount of consultations. But we're familiar with that, and we'll answer the questions. We'll do informal mentoring. NSAI has great resources. It really is just for the taking.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, you guys have just been fantastic. I have enjoyed this enormously. It wasn't as scary as my first meeting at the NSAI. We have had not too many acronyms in there. But Barry, I say it was scary the first day, but I absolutely loved that whole process that I was involved in. And there is nothing more satisfying than the day we signed off on that and published it. And there was this massive sense of achievement by a group of people who we would never have ordinarily found ourselves being able to do something like that. So yeah, one of the most standout moments in my tech life was when we did that with the NSAI. So thank you for that experience. Thank you all for participating on my panel today, for the IVI for inviting me, and Empower for inviting me to chair this session. I am going to ask anyone who's listening in or listening back to this later to sign up for the newsletter. Stay in touch with the guys at info@ivi.ie. And yes, all of the links to everything there are there. So without further ado, they're after pointing a cursor. I'm to tell you, the IVI, oh yes, I spoke at this last year. The IVI Summit 2024 is called Digital, Unleashing the Power of Data and Services. So put that save the date in your diary. I know I will be doing it, the 11th and 12th of June. You see, they've got a little pointer here working for me. I have literally no job to do. So the 11th and 12th of June, I will see you all, hopefully at Maynooth University, for the IVI Summit 2024. As I say, I had the great privilege of speaking at it last year, and hope to be there again, supporting the guys with Empower and IVI. So thank you all very, very much. And without further ado, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks very much, Joan. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.